to give us an overview of the DPI session, I'm going to ask Eduardo to give us a preview.
Thank you, Frank. And it's great being here. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to give you a brief intro about what's coming next this morning. We'll have a special focus on digital public infrastructure. This is a theme that really we all have been talking about a lot more in the last year at GPFI. It became like a key theme last year during the Indian presidency, and it continued to be here. And when we met last time in Bengaluru, just almost exactly a year ago, that we learned incredible stories about the acceleration in financial inclusion that happened with Aadhaar, the digital ID system, with UPI. And now, here in Brazil, we're having similar conversations about PIX, for example, about open banking, and how those layers, how those products are enabling an acceleration in inclusive finance. Now, what we wanted to do in this session, we wanted to structure it a bit differently, in the sense that we have learned about the incredible success stories from India, from Brazil, and from Estonia, a few other markets. But as this becomes more of a theme that is being introduced also in new market contexts with different political, economic, social situations, the introduction of DPI may face different type of challenges. So the way we've structured the conversation this morning is that we'll have 3 sessions, one after the other, in which we look at different perspectives, different conversations that look at slightly different angles from what we normally see in the current literature. On the one hand, we'll start with a focus on Kenya, actually, a country, and Julie will be there. I'm very excited about it. A country that has been trying to introduce a digital ID system, but in a very different context, in a context of distrust, in a context where economic issues around indebtedness of the country has really received a very negative reception from the public. And so we want to see how that experience, what we can learn from that experience as we think about DPI, digital ID in particular, going into other markets. We'll then get into a session, an interactive session managed by the UN Tech Envoy, who basically will help us guide a conversation around how do we think about DPI, how do we think about the safeguards in DPI, and what do we need to do in order to prioritize these safeguards as we design DPI in the future. Finally, we'll get to a session with David Porteous, really honored to have him here, who has done work recently thinking about what is the meaning, what are the principles for consumer-centric DPI. Very often when we think about DPI, we think about it from the technology point of view, from a government point of view. But if we take the other end of the spectrum, we take the perspective of consumers, how do we think about it? So really excited. This is just a brief summary of the session. I'll pass it back on to you, Frank, for the individual introduction. But really what we want to do here is to enable a conversation. We want to learn from one another. We want to also define how do we shape the conversation going forward over the next year. So really excited by this session, really excited about the feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Great. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julie Zollman. She's based in Nairobi. She's the author of Living on Little, and today she lends her expertise on how the Global South interacts with a digitizing world. So, please welcome Dr. Julie Zollman.
Good morning. I hope you're all warming up with your coffee and the open doors. If you need to stand up, I won't be offended. So thank you, CFI, for having me and enabling our team to explore this topic, culminating in a paper that we'll share with you after the event. And there's much more detail there, so I'm going to be running through things pretty quickly. I'm very also happy that my co-author, Nanjira Sambuli, is here with us today online. She is with us virtually. She's a policy researcher that's helping many of us understand Africa's changing digital landscapes. She's going to make a few remarks as we close up this session. I'm grateful that CFI has made space for this dialogue, thinking about what responsible DPI really means. Because in my view, the stakes are actually very high. Most of the past 12 years, I've been living in Kenya as a researcher, and I'm currently becoming a citizen, fingers crossed. It's a strange and uncertain time to be becoming a citizen in Kenya if you've been following the news. And I feel very personally invested, as is Nanjira, in Kenya's future, both in terms of how digitalization evolves and our broader political landscape. You're going to hear me talk more about citizens than consumers today. I think when we talk about the DPI context, we need to shift from a landscape where we used to talk about people's choices, consumer protection, and now we're moving into a place where they're often sort of practically forced into new systems, and so rights have to come front and center. And citizen doesn't mean to exclude residents and refugees, but it, I think, implies a different kind of sets of obligations and processes. In this small piece of research I'm going to share today, we asked, what do we know about Kenya's emergent DPI ecosystem? How do citizens, firms, and civil society perceive it? Kenya is really starting on this journey with a digital ID that's called the Maisha number. And this is its first step towards what they're calling DPI in the government level, in spite of lots of digitalization efforts that have been ongoing for many years. We spoke with 53 citizens in focus groups and one-on-one interviews in Nairobi and Bungoma County, including a stronghold of the current president during May of this year to pull this perspective gathering together. We spoke with civil society organizations, private firms who rely on ID, donors, and other ecosystem players. The views on Kenya's emerging DPI were not very rosy. The Maisha number, or life number, is meant to be assigned at birth and follow you until your 18th birthday, when it becomes your national ID and is used across all government systems. Right now, the same analog process for applying for an ID is what feeds into the Maisha number, which is simply a new card with a chip. It's more expensive, and as Najira will talk more about, there's an expiration date. Citizens think there could hypothetically be a benefit if this single ID actually works across lots of different government services, but they don't believe that the government is committed to implementing this well and delivering on that benefit of consolidation. Information about the Maisha number is extremely limited. In fact, there is no public documentation of what it entails, how it will work, how much it will cost, and who's paying for it, even though it's already rolling out. The private sector is frustrated. They expect no new functionality and instead new burdens of upgrading their software and dealing with new and legacy systems simultaneously. Civil society is mobilizing to really understand and try to engage. They bemoan the lack of government and, frankly, donor transparency. They recognize that these systems are capturing sensitive citizen data and entail significant risks of both wasted resources and misuse. And the donors are pushing for some engagement with that civil society, but often that's in very tokenistic and peripheral ways. But before we get into what we heard from citizens, if we take a step back and think about what would be the benefits of a digital ID, we looked across the literature and sort of saw that these potential benefits fell into 4 buckets. Coverage, so expanding who the ID reaches, remote authentication and eKYC, eliminating the need for a physical ID, and increasing back-end efficiencies across government agencies. Of course, whether these are achieved is very contingent on the context and for other systems being in place. You can't really increase coverage unless there are current gaps that the new system actually addresses. You can only get back-end efficiencies if you're able to entice all government agencies to move into accepting one new universal ID rather than building duplicate processes. There could also be lots of downstream benefits. We often hear about limiting leakages in social safety nets or eliminating ghost workers. Well, you have to have a safety net in order to remove leakages from it, and you have to have the political capital to eliminate those kinds of leakages. Where conditions are not in place, digital ID can do little to deliver citizen benefits. And where we are transitioning from one ID to another, we're talking about marginal benefits. So where are we today, and what more are we gaining from a new system? Obviously, those gains are much larger where the current systems are relatively weak. There are also lots of risks that come along with digital ID, and I think that the Gelb and Diafasi-Metz book from 2018 from Center for Global Development outlines these very well. So they talk about 3 categories, one being exclusion. This can be discrimination, but also cost. And those exclusions can compound when it means that you're also denied access to services, work, or travel because you can't get an ID. There's also the risk of misuse from lack of good data protection and also intended misuse around government surveillance. Another category of risk that I don't see us talking very much about in the DPI literature is the risk of ineffective investment and waste. Where governments have a low commitment to implementation, they're not likely to deliver strong benefits. There's also an important thing to think about in terms of opportunity costs. When we invest in digital ID, what are we foregoing? The risks that I see are partly functions of government motivation. So it's important that we be thinking about why are they pursuing a digital ID. So our team in Kenya was asking, what are the risks and benefits of a digital ID? And what can that tell us about the conditions under which DPI can deliver citizen value? The proponents of DPI seem to have an implicit and sometimes explicit notion about what the role of the state is and the nature of the government. They tend to fall into this category here of Yves and Mazzucato, who imagine that the state is a public value maximizer, that they should be taking proactive steps to be engaged in the economy and to advance development. But many scholars don't see states like this. James C. Scott, for example, argues that states have a compulsion to control, that their pursuit of bureaucratic technologies is a form of high modernist authoritarianism. The famous Africanist scholar Tandika Mkandawire argued that development states, in the image of Mazzucato, are possible in Africa, but require two critical conditions. The first is that they have a true pro-development ideology among the ruling elite, and the second is that public officials are isolated from private interest. So I think it's important to think about under what states do these kinds of conditions hold. So we are hypothesizing that good outcomes from DPI are essentially a function of two critical facets. One is the commitment that governments have to high quality implementation. I think those are a function of state motivations. This means that they have a serious commitment to realizing public value. The second is having an effective accountability environment. This engages civil society, legislatures that hold officials accountable for effective implementation, and judiciaries. This mitigates against overreach and reduces the risk of waste. So where commitments are high, but accountability weak, I suspect that we're going to end up with surveillance states enabled by DPI. Where both are limited, I find that we're in a high-risk DPI scenario. We really need both of these factors to come together in order to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we really care about. What do we see when we look at the Kenya experience with this new digital ID? Well, this is not our first attempt at digital ID, unfortunately. We've had a number of previous failures in which hundreds of millions of dollars have been wasted and countless hours of citizen time delivering absolutely nothing of value to Kenyans. The most public of these failures was the Huduma number in 2018 and 19. This was framed as developing a single source of truth about Kenyans. It required all Kenyans and residents to re-register with the government, providing facial photos and fingerprint biometrics. Citizens were threatened with deportation if they did not comply. It involved thousands of clerks manually entering data, typing it into a tablet, making lots of mistakes along the way. The queues were exceptionally long, typically requiring at least one full day of waiting. 37 million people invested their time and shared their sensitive data into this system, which was later suspended by the courts, which agreed with complainants that there was insufficient supporting legislation supporting this and ensuring data protection, and that the extent of biometric capture that was allowed under the new system, which included DNA, was excessive. So though he was deputy president at the time, President Ruto has subsequently called this a fraud and says that it wasted at least $115 million. Government put up little fight to salvage the effort, which raises questions about their initial intentions. In the meantime, we have no idea what's happened to the data. However, even though we've had lots of public failures around digital ID, we've had lots of progress in our core national ID over time. Our first ID system was known as the kipande, and it was issued by the colonial authority, meant to be worn around the neck. This created a lot of resistance from Kenyans who felt the colonialists were trying to tag them the same way they tagged their dogs. So convincing people that it was worth getting an ID took a long time. Eventually, we've come to having a national ID. It has no expiration date. It has your name, your home area, your photo, manually collected fingerprints that link into a national database. It also has some legacy things like your tribe and your home area that sort of tag you with which ethnic group you belong. Since 2011, we've also had an evolving system of linked government databases that make this effectively a digital ID. This is called the IPRS, or Integrated Population Registry System. It allows your name and ID to be authenticated through the underlying database, and this is the foundation for our credit registry system. While imperfect, the new ID reaches most Kenyans. The FinAccess survey of 2021 found 91% coverage, and the government now claims that that's up to 96%, with most of those excluded being very young people that are still in the process of acquiring their first ID. The IPRS system works pretty well as well for remote authentication. Instances of duplicates and errors have largely been eliminated. And those we talk to who do credit reference checks, who do fraud monitoring, find that this is quite good at serving its functions. From the perspective of citizen, civil society, and private sector, the current problems with birth registration and ID actually have to do with how difficult it is to get, the bureaucratic process being very clunky. It's inefficient, there's discrimination, you have to know someone or typically pay a bribe to get this, and there's a lot of discretionary barriers that are put in place by local chiefs and registration officials. But the MISHA number follows the exact same procedure. There's zero change. And in the contrary, you have to now renew this ID. So every 10 years, you're expected to undergo this process again. All the associated bribes and hurdles. Civil society feels like digitalization is actually focusing in the wrong place. What we should be doing, one person told us, is crafting identity systems that do not let people fall through the cracks. And the cracks are not unintentional, they're intentional. The current systems, for example, require that Muslims and minorities go through extra hoops, paying extra bribes, facilitation fees, and different kinds of vetting to make sure that they're actually citizens. They make it very difficult for children of single parents to access an ID, and they throw up these discretionary barriers for people who are out of favor or unable to bribe the local officials. So the digital ID fails to address the key issues that we have in the current system of our ID. Trust is really undermined by really poor performing digitalization in other areas of the government. The World Bank has actually been leading and helping the government digitize through 3 key initiatives that are very much public facing and in the public consciousness. IFMIS is a World Bank implemented project that is meant to help improve audit trails for government spending. But our Auditor General says it has actually made it harder to audit government agencies, and has obscured some of the trails that are important for finding out where money has went. And this is not an unusual problem. Many countries have had this problem with IFMIS systems worldwide. We've recently introduced a new digital tax policy, and this is called eTIMS. So it was meant to help the smallest businesses issue tax-compliant invoices. And those invoices are required for all formal businesses reporting on their expenditures. Not only is this regressive and that it passes on outsized costs to the smallest businesses in our economy, it's rarely functional. For an entire month, this system was down between mid-May and mid-June, bringing all invoicing to a halt. eCitizen is another that is really becoming increasingly important. It's a 10-plus-year-old platform that digitizes applications and payments for a range of government services. This imposes new burdens on citizens who must have digital access. They have to pay new fees in order to access any of these services. And they often have to go to a cyber cafe where a human attendant walks them through these complicated processes on applications that have really terrible UX and also are often down. In 2019, the Department of Criminal Investigations began a probe into the transaction fee that's charged on every interaction that people have with this service. No one knew this transaction fee of 50 shillings per service was going to a private company with no legal authorization to collect revenue on behalf of the government. The Auditor General has introduced a forensic audit in the system with similar concerns about the opaque channeling of the revenues through the system. In the last year, the government rushed to onboard 5,000 services onto this system through a single payment channel. This has led to a crisis in service delivery because of the unreliability of this system. One of the respondents that we met in the course of this research was a 40-year-old woman with a 17-year-old daughter who was pregnant. Her daughter went into labor and she was really struggling and in and out of consciousness, so the mom rushed her to the local national hospital. eCitizen was down, so they couldn't accept a deposit over the system. They left this girl in crisis in the waiting room for 4 hours, waiting until eCitizen came back online. When the eCitizen came online, the mother paid a deposit. They rushed the girl to the theater to deliver her baby through an emergency C-section. But the child was deprived of oxygen that entire time and has lifelong brain damage. All of which is so in November last year, the World Bank has renewed its support for eCitizen and eTIMS through what they call the GESDEC 2 initiative. When you read their assessment of the social risks from this project, it's rather alarming. We recognize the risks around digital literacy, the lack of dispute resolution mechanisms, but the risks relating to wasteful expenditure, theft of revenue, system unreliability, the interruption of critical service delivery, the disruption to smooth business operations, or the retrogressive nature of imposing high relative costs on small businesses is completely overlooked. All of which is to say, I just don't think we fully understand the spectrum of potential harms from government digitalization nor DPI. In light of these experiences and their real-world interaction with the state, our respondents expect very little benefit from MISHA number in practice. Given the many issues the country is facing and the extensive number of projects that the government is pursuing, while struggling under an enormous debt burden, as Eduardo mentioned, citizens are just wondering, why is this a priority? But they feel a bit hopeless. The government will do what it wants to do. When we asked about the government moving into managing a payment system, our respondents were extremely skeptical that the government would do a good job. They feared that they would be careless, but more than that, they feared corruption. The government officials would introduce fees that would be siphoned off for individual benefit. They don't think it would run efficiently and safely. They trust Safaricom, a partially state-owned telco, much, much more. Most of those that we spoke with felt that the marginal benefits of the new idea were very small, that there was very little case for actually pursuing a digital ID. One person told us very bluntly, for example, it's just a way of eating money. So if the government motivations are mostly about rent extraction around procurement, their commitment to ensuring citizen benefits may be very weak. What about the accountability environment? Political developments in the country have limited legislative checks and balances. That was the impetus for the major strikes that you saw in the past couple of weeks. And the judiciary, while it hasn't initially resisted the Hadouman number, is subject to political pressure in the long run. Accountability by civil society is possible, but inhibited by the lack of transparency around the initiative. Unfortunately, donors play a role here. There's 2.7 billion shillings of donor funding in next year's budget supporting this initiative, and it's completely unclear who's providing that funding. The terms of the agreements are not public. Donor funding is in some ways circumventing the public debate that might surround taxpayer allocations. Donors have been drawing civil society into some of these discussions, but it's typically in a peripheral and subordinate way. So what does this mean for wider debates around DPI? I fear that Kenya is heading to the red zone of DPI, given that there's low government commitment to high-quality implementation and a relatively weak accountability environment. So it's a question for all of us is, does this framing hold? When you've seen your examples out in the wild, where did they fall? And what conditions have enabled that? I think that there are three other implications for us to consider. First, cases like this call for humility around DPI. There are very significant risks that I don't believe can be managed with technical safeguards alone. We need to be much more honest about the unknowns. Second, I think it suggests adopting an expansive interest in the types of digitalization that are emerging in practice around the world so that we can reckon with the emergent infrastructures as they are, and not just those that live up to our normative ideals of high-functioning DPI. Third, we need a lot more knowledge. We need more cases in more settings to understand these kinds of political conditions that lead to good outcomes. We need to be measuring those outcomes, both for our learning and to hold governments accountable for what they're actually achieving for their citizens. And third, I think we need to understand more about general equilibrium effects. It's all well and good to say that 71 million people are using digital payments, but where is that taking us? What does it mean for business? What does it mean in the long term for our economies? And with that, I'd like to hand over to Nanjira, who will share a few reflections directly from Kenya. Nanjira, thanks so much.
Greetings from Nairobi. I'll just pick up from where Julie left off and speak to other implications along three core planks. First of all, I think the experience we're having with Maisha number and Huduma number before it are really indicative of the dwindling trust that is coming up in digital IDs specifically, but also in digitalization broadly. For example, with the Maisha number that has been introduced, there is an expiry date. I think it's a 10-year lifespan that it has. The government has not really gone into any detail to explain why that exists, but the lens around which that is being analyzed is the fact that that would allow within the political system to suppress voters, for example, where you have IDs expiring in one area, and when come election season, that area is starved of resources to renew IDs and so on. And this is already a very vibrant discussion in the sort of iterative process of these protests that you're witnessing today. What does it mean to have an ID that is expiring? Is it because of biometrics? Is it because of any other reason? There has been no explanation of that, and that is creating a distrust. Secondly, the cost of issuing IDs and replacing IDs has increased tenfold in the country. Now, this is creating the risk of making it seem that digitalization means increased cost to access services. You had Julie talk about the e-citizen platform that has that convenience fee, such that the cost of a convenience fee can be 50% of the cost of a service that you're looking for in several instances, actually. So that idea that now the digitalization means more cost to the consumer is going to create a trust deficit. Then the other aspect, and this is something I've experienced myself, from the fact that the government is not issuing policy papers or speaking to the public locally, but will speak internationally. I was at a conference recently, and the principal secretary in charge of immigration and this ID process was more intent on speaking to the revenue that they've generated through digitalizing government systems through the e-citizen platform than on the quality of services that they're offering. They were the only actors take to that particular stage and talk about digitalization's benefits from the point of government generating revenue and not from citizen service provision. And that was very instructive. And this creates the impression, and is already creating the impression, that the push to digitize services in Kenya is about the government getting more money and not really delivering on the services, a core issue that took people to the streets and has kept us there for 3 weeks. And considering that the same analog challenges exist in accessing services like the ID process that Julie just described, coupled with the hurdles of significant downtime services of so many of the services, including mobile money, the M-Pesa platform, and attendant cyber threats that are hardly ever addressed, these are serious risks that are creating a trust deficit. Now, you might sit there and think, well, Maisha number may not fit the definitional aspects of DPI, but what we wager is that with Maisha number as the ID plank, e-citizen is sort of like a government data exchange, however imperfect it is, and M-Pesa sort of running as a national mobile money payments platform and digital payments platform, we are seeing Kenyans being introduced to what would be concepts of DPI. So rather than getting lost on whether those fit the DPI script, we should use this as a really viable opportunity to observe, document, and learn from these actual examples of what is emerging in practice, regardless of whether they adhere to the ideals of the DPI narrative. So I'll conclude by just saying that, Kenya's DPI journey is sitting in that high-risk zone that Julie showed us. The marginal benefits are sitting alongside significant risks of harm, and these are raising larger questions about DPI. I hope that you can discuss, for example, what standards of transparency and accountability are being set and implemented in practice in this case, whether it fits the DPI narrative or not, but is what people are experiencing. To whom are development partners accountable and transparent to their country engagements and investments, given the complexity of these DPI systems that require public, private sector, and civil society engagement? Julie spoke about the fact that civil society in Kenya wants to be involved but is not invited to the table. But we see a lot of push by international actors within the country and abroad to push this DPI narrative. And how those who are promoting DPI can consider this local political context. And again, Kenya is very instructive for the sort of uprising that we're seeing right now, to think about the governance arrangements of interventions and how these topics can be centered in decision-making, considering DPI investments. Lastly, I'll just say, one of the things that we're seeing in the discussions off the streets is the fact that these systems that are seen as wasteful are being proposed to be taken away with, and that could set us back. And in Kenya, because we've always celebrated the narrative and the hype, we see a real risk here of the international community not learning from the citizens themselves. So let's all use this example to learn on sometimes how not to do DPI. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nanjira. That's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julie. It was a great presentation. And as mentioned, there's a lot of lessons to learn from Kenya. We wanted to bring this up as a way to discuss how things can go in a different way from what we expect. Right? We have learned last year, as I mentioned earlier, about India, which had a different, where DPI had a very different impact. And here in Brazil, we've been having a conversation. We wanted to bring this perspective as well to provoke you, to provoke some thoughts and discussions about what should we think about as we expand, as we take DPI as an approach that we want to take in other countries beyond those that we have discussed so far. And also the link to financial inclusion is a very important one. How does ID link to now more inclusive financial services? Here, there's a lot of background and context that prevented that link that we want to make between DPI and financial inclusion. In other markets may be different, but understanding the context is very important. So that's the type of discussion we wanted to enable through this. Now, I pass it on to you, Frank, to introduce the next session.
Thank you very much. My Swahili is a little rough, but asante sana to Nanjira and Julie for those perspectives from Kenya. I think just one quick reflection that I might just add, and this was a conversation had at breakfast, is really the importance of language. And I will tell you, coming from the political world, how important language is. But it's also the language and the lexicon that we embed in our regulations and in our laws. And here, in this digital finance space, we often talk about data governance. And there are specific terms that, for me as a person who's not as involved, is very interesting to understand. An individual whose data is collected is the data subject. Those who control the post-collection are data controllers. Those that process the data are data processors. India has done something very interesting, and perhaps most of you know, but I did not know this. India has possibly changed the way that laws are made by changing the naming convention. Let me explain that. Individuals whose data is collected are considered data principals. Data principals. And more interestingly, those who collect data, according to the naming convention, are data fiduciaries. Data fiduciaries. I think that's a very important distinction, because we all know that the role of a fiduciary, whether you're a member of a board or whether you're a financial fiduciary that takes care of somebody's pension or retirement, you have a moral obligation. You have a fiduciary obligation to that client. And so we're talking about the responsibility to treat data with respect and care to ensure that we continue to build trust. The power of words, the lexicon. And I say this coming from a man that worked with Obama, lexicon is so important in what we do. So again, asante sana to our colleagues from Kenya. I want to now move this conversation along to talk more about DPI safeguards. And we have the advisor from the Office of the UN Secretary Special Envoy on Technology. I'd like to welcome Moritz up to this stage. Welcome, Moritz. Moritz is very humble. When I asked Moritz, how should I introduce you? He said, no, don't say much. I said, well, okay, I'll say that you saved 300 children from a dragon. And he said that would be a great introduction. So, Moritz, please, the Dragon Slayer.
Thanks, Frank. All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before we get started, I would just like to say a warm welcome also on behalf of the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, and a heartfelt thank you to our dear colleagues at Axion who are giving us this great space to pick your brains today. So in the next 60 minutes, I've brought 3 personal objectives that I would like to work through with all of you. So my first goal that I've brought is that I would like to show to all of the participants in this room why this conversation that we're having around DPI safeguards is relevant for everyone who's participating in this session here today. And during the second element, we'll be having a little workshop. And my objective here is to pick your brains and take all of the knowledge that is being created in this session to the multi-stakeholder working groups that are developing the DPI safeguards framework to ensure that also your perspectives are reflected, and it may also become a useful resource for all of you. Lastly, I hope that this is not a one-off, but ideally that should be the beginning of a closer collaboration with the DPI Safeguards Initiative and the organizations that you all represent here. Okay, I'm going to the wrong direction. There we go. All right, so I would just like to begin with the first objective and point to why DPI safeguards are relevant to all of us. So we see in our own organizations that governments, donors, everyone is increasing their attention on digital public infrastructure. And as Julie and Nigeria pointed out, a lot can go wrong. And also the United Nations and the Secretary General acknowledged this fact. And therefore, in his policy brief for the Global Digital Compact, the Secretary General called for the creation of common frameworks on digital public infrastructure to ensure that there's good guidance on how those systems are built. On top of this, the UN member states will adopt the Global Digital Compact in September. For those who do not know what this is the member states of the United Nations coming together, adopting a compact which covers a broad array of topics, but is basically about the globally shared values underlying the global digital transformation. And you can read the current text on our website, and their digital public infrastructure is one of the key priority areas where the member states call for investments into. So what does all of this mean for us here? This means that the topic of DPI will stick around for a while, and you here in the room may be the people building those systems, or the solutions and policies that you develop interact with these systems. But one way or the other, this is something that is going to be relevant for you possibly. And I would like to broaden the scope from just Kenya, because Kenya is not alone with its challenges. It's really a whole array of countries that have been struggling to build the society-wide digital systems, and I think there are a few recurring topics there. I think one key topic is the lack of trust that citizens have in these systems, the lack of governance around them, leading to them being held up in courts, and all of this leads to these systems not being able to have the positive effects that they can under the right circumstances. Just want to briefly show how such a meta-level risk translates to something tangible. So I can give a concrete example. Say for instance, you build a digital payment system and that system is only available in urban areas and neglects rural areas, then this leads to the economic benefits of digital payments only being available in urban settings, exacerbating the rural-urban divide, and therefore leading to us not achieving SDG number 10, reducing global inequalities to the extent it would be possible. So what is the answer to all of this? Currently, we do not have a good global understanding of what safeguards governments should have in place. And this really shows at different levels. So imagine you are a civil society organization and your government is building a new system, then there's just no global anchor point, no global standard, nothing that is acknowledged at the global level that you can point towards and that you can use to hold your government accountable. At the same time, say you are a government, someone working in a ministry, what we often see is that also within governments, there's a lack of capacity with regards to the question how systems can be built in a way that is safe and inclusive. So the Secretary General's answer to, or what a piece of that answer to that problem was his call for the creation of common frameworks. And this is why the DPI Safeguards initiative was launched during the UN General Assembly last year. And I just quickly want to tell you what it is exactly that is being developed in order to make it tangible for you. So the center pillar of the initiative is the DPI Safeguards framework. And this is going to be a knowledge resource to which all of you will be contributing today. And we're developing this framework together with multi-stakeholder working groups from across the world, from the private sector, government, and civil society, to ensure it really reflects all perspectives. And I just want to take a second to illustrate how a user would make use of this framework. So all of this knowledge will be organized in a way so that, for instance, say I'm an employee of a civil society organization and my government is building a specific system right now, then I can consult this resource and extract the practices, processes that are relevant for this specific use case. The second key pillar is the in-country implementation. We have an implementing partner that we co-lead the Safeguards Initiative with, that is the United Nations Development Program, who are going to introduce the framework in their in-country implementations. And we're also working with more than 10 other international organizations on how the topic of DPI safeguards can be mainstreamed in, for instance, the World Bank or other international development banks. Lastly, there will also be a resources hub where we collect case studies. So if you have interesting case studies, feel free to share them with us so we can make them publicly available. Okay, so that should have covered objective number 1, and everyone should have understood why this is a relevant conversation to be had here. Now I would like to move to objective number 2, which is co-creating what goes into the DPI safeguards framework. So in the next 30 minutes, we will be working in breakout groups, and you will identify DPI systems or use cases, and you'll be linking those use cases with the positive outcomes that they have for individuals, for consumers, for businesses, and society overall. Then we'll continue to thinking about what are the risks that we associate with those systems. And then the last step is linking those risks with mitigation measures that governments or other stakeholders should put in place in order to ensure these risks do not materialize. Let me say a few words on process. You don't have to do this all by yourself. There is a facilitator, ideally on each table. So if maybe the facilitators could briefly raise their hands so we can make sure you are equally distributed. It's great to see that everyone's so involved in creating good mitigation measures. We are now going into the final segment of this session, which will be a brief share out. So we have a microphone over there, and I came up with 3 guiding questions that you can stick to or not stick to. This is just a suggestion. What I would ask you is to be brief, so that as many people as possible can get the word. And also, there you see a QR code. We would love to engage with you more in the future. So if you want that as well, feel free to scan it and leave your email address there, and we will reach out to you in the future. Who would like to start sharing the findings of their group? All right.
All right, so we'll share a couple of thoughts here. We didn't go to the solutions, but we did open finance and PIX, because we have the luxury of having a representative from the Central Bank of Brazil with us. So on the PIX, it seemed quite a successful adventure. Some of the benefits was the increased affordability, the speed of payments, the accessibility. It's very easy to understand apparently, so a lot of consumers, get on it. In terms of the risks, we have frauds, although they are not as high as expected. Crime, I can't remember which kind of crime. Transfers to the wrong people, a bit like we have in mobile money, where you put the wrong number and then the money goes to the wrong person. And data leaks are also possible. This is for open finance, no? Yeah. So that's it. In this one too, I think. No? All right. Then the open finance, some of the advantages: more competition, more services. It's increased savings in Brazil. Also through some better advice to consumers, so they have more savings, and also better interest rates on credit. Some of the risks is that banks do not always want to cooperate, and there is limited awareness of open finance among consumers. It's more complicated also for consumers to use, so it requires more literacy. So it's both about awareness and skills. So there is also a risk of exclusion that comes from this. And then there is potential, that was data leaks and sensitive data being shared against the consumer's wish. Anything else? Thank you.
So we started on the sort of the application side, thinking of use cases around sort of healthcare data exchange, education verification. So we're really thinking on sort of the user side of how that would play out in contrast to sort of an open finance or other sort of systems level perspectives. And so with that context, our positive outcomes were fairly clear, a lot around efficiencies and costs, et cetera, some transparency. What we noticed, rather than walking through all the risks, which I suspect many people have the same set of risks, is, very quickly we realized we're coming up with probably more mitigation measures relative to the risks, right? So that's kind of an indicator, in terms of what we think needs to happen. All of these systems need to be in place to manage just one or two clear risks. One thing we noticed as well is a lot of the mitigation measures relied on government and government systems to be implemented, but if one of your risks is misuse by government, then you have a challenge there. So one thing we put in as sort of a late addition is the role of civil society and the capacity to advocate for consumers really powerfully and upfront in building up those systems as a function of, the clear risk that, never attribute to malice. That can be explained by incompetence, right? It's just sometimes things don't work. And so maybe civil society has a role in making sure that they do. One thing we also talked about was just on the capacity side to build and sustain and measure. And I'm going to ask everyone a question. May I? How many IT people do you think run the PIX platform? If you think more than 100, raise your hand. If you think it's not 100, if you think it's more than 50, raise your hand, but less than 100. How many people would believe me if I said it was 10? 10 people, right? And so the question is, what's the right number of people who you need to manage what has become a systemically important platform here, and not to mention also the consumer protection side, the data measurement, et cetera. So that was one of the elements that came out on the risk side, is all of this could be great, you build a great system, it's managed well, it's governed well, but then you need to maintain and sustain it as it grows. And then are you investing in the systems and the people to be able to do that? Over and out.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so this table focused, we had the opportunity to have Portugal and the UK represented here, and we honed in on open taxes as a use case, focusing on, in Portugal, workers, as well as in the UK with a focus on small business. And in terms of sort of looking at some of the positive outcomes from this kind of open tax use case, fewer errors. It really tries to incorporate more of self-employed individuals, bank details that are pre-filled or tend to be more accurate, more time saving, less fear of taxes, and administrative cost for the state is conceivably lower. All right, so but on the risk side, it has the potential, especially on the small business side, to leave out the unbanked or those that are still cash-based. We also identified a number of lacking digital skills by segment, so age-related, maybe lower education or literacy rates, the rural-urban divides, and then lower income segments. And then we talked about just kind of learning from the example from the Kenyan example was it's critical to really have a built-in level of trust to really make these systems work. And in terms of mitigation, we talked, I think what was kind of an interesting theme here was there needs to be a feedback loop for redress, and it needs to not only be tech, but a real person, so combining that tech and touch. Including other players, technology players in the system, so MNOs, ID operators, communications companies. And then we had a little bit of conversation around, okay, how do you offer then financial literacy and education? We had a little debate there on how you target, is it effective? And then we talked a little bit about integrating behavioral nudges into the UX. So that was a little summary of our table. Anything we want to add that I missed?
Good morning, everyone. So our table has a very diverse mix of people. I am from India, she is from UK, Argentinians, Colombia, and we also have representatives from Brazil. So it's a diverse group. The DPI system we selected was credit database. Just to differentiate, it's the credit information system for the individuals, and not the credit rating agencies. And so we thought it has to be a DPI system. What is the positive outcome? Obviously, access for all, affordability, standardization. Normally in the CICs nowadays, I don't want to take names, you see different credit score from different companies for the same individual. DPI can solve for it. Then you have the data quality. Your address, maybe you're living in Washington, but your address being shown as in Seattle. So that is supposed to be the data quality issues with many of the CICs. You have awareness. Most of the consumers doesn't know that what is the credit score. Either they have to pay for it or they are unaware of it. Then usage and adoption. I don't know when I need to use my credit score, for what purpose. So those are positive outcomes which DPI comes with it based on the design. What are the risks? This is very important. I think our previous table discussed about a risk, how if the government is not implementing in the right way. I think that's a greater debate to solve. If the government is not working, there is judiciary is not working, civil society. But I think it is beyond DPI scope to solve for the government or political issues. But still, we have inherent risk like any other digital systems. On data security, yeah, we have to have a proper data security protocol. Then we have to have a data quality standardization, and in terms of how you dedupe the data, how do you maintain the right data into the system, what is the input and the output quality. Similarly, there is things of data audits, which the risk will be of discretionary reporting. Some of the CICs, if not actually being governed, may discretionary report. I think our friend from Colombia mentioned a nice case study that if they are defaulting on your loan, they will not report it to the banks. So the CICs have the discretion of not reporting that if you're going delinquent. So the banks will not have the right data. So that's also something, a discretionary reporting. There is exclusion, it's based on rules-based credit information. So there is a risk of exclusion. Then there is also predatory pricing. So someone may cost, there is unusually high, someone may cost cheap, but it's not based on the discretion of the CICs if there is a monopoly or oligopoly, right? Then we have a lack of transparency. What data is getting reported, what data is not getting reported. Hardly customers have any insights to that. Then lack of redressal. If my data is wrong, if my credit score should be high, it's low, I don't have any redressal opportunities. Then lack of capacity. So all this to be built, you need capacity to build the CICs and to build a DPI for that. So mitigation measures, I think there is a lot we have identified, but very briefly, we should need to have authorized access. We should have encryption of the data. We should have standardization of security audits. It should be also international standards, certifications. Data privacy laws has to be enacted, which should govern the credit bureaus. Capacity for supervision and enforcement. The regulatory bodies should have capacity, else I think all the effort will go for a waste. Pricing policy, how much will be the pricing? There should be a floor rather than ceiling of the pricing. That should be mandated. Consumer education, data standardization, clear terms and conditions, redressal mechanism, and consumer representation, or the consumer should have some authority to represent if their data is wrong. I think these are the exhaustive list of the things which we have identified. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Also, on behalf of the Office of the SG Summer Technology, big thanks to the participants and facilitators. So what I will do next is take pictures of all of this, compile it into a session summary, and this will be forwarded to our working group members so it can be included in the DPI safeguards framework. If you or your organization is interested in replicating sessions like this, maybe tapping into your own networks, do let us know. We're always happy to collaborate. And we're looking to publish the first iteration of the DPI safeguards framework at the UN General Assembly in September. So keep an eye out and let us know what you think. And with that, I'm handing back over to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moritz. There's a great saying, It just came to mind, and it's, you can spend all day chasing a butterfly, or you can build a garden and have all the butterflies come to you. This is what we see here. We've got a great amount of talent and skills to be able to contribute to a UN protocol. So wonderful. Thank you, Moritz. With that, Moritz has a lot of work to take back with him and a lot of feedback. One word that has come out that you've heard earlier this morning and again today in this session is user-centric. So with that, I would love to invite two of our distinguished colleagues, David Porteous and Mayara Yano, to the stage to help lead us in that conversation. Thank you and welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It almost is good afternoon, and that's a reminder to Mayara and myself not to last too long in this session, so you can get out into the garden, Frank, that you talk about. So first, our thanks to the organizers, to CFI, who've pulled together this whole event, and indeed this rich session that we've just come out of today. And we do want to reflect on DPI from a slightly different angle, but it's an angle which goes back to a core question that Julie raised in her excellent presentation earlier, which is, what does a high-functioning DPI look like? We know from the Deputy Governor's presentation earlier this morning, it's not just about big numbers, because we know there are big numbers represented here on the stage. It's about people, you told us, Deputy Governor. And in many ways, that's the reason for introducing a concept, a general concept, and then a specific lens through which to look at it. And it's this concept of user-centricity. So we want to talk about that, specifically looking at how PIX has been an example of thinking about that, and I'm sure has more yet to do, as we'll hear from Mayara Yano, who is with me. Mayara is part of the team that manages PIX, and as you've heard, it's a remarkably small team that has achieved remarkably big numbers. But we're not here to be impressed by the big numbers. We're here to ask, what do those mean? What do those tell us about this big question about a high-functioning DPI? So just very quickly to frame this question, the issue of user-centricity is not a new one, right? It's one which in the tech world and in the private sector, in many ways is a sine qua non. You can't launch a new product or service without thinking about that today, without paying attention to it. But it's one which is perhaps more recent, creeping into the public sector, which it has done in recent years. In OECD guidelines 2 years ago, for example, which brought this concept of citizen centricity, or let's use the word user, because as we're talking payment systems, they are citizens, and they are consumers because they have choices, actually, but let's use the word user as our standard language. I think we need to make one further language discussion here. So we haven't seen this concept applied to DPI for a reason, because what does it mean in the context of infrastructure? Particularly, what does it mean for infrastructure that doesn't directly touch end users? So who are we talking about? Who are the users here? And so maybe some language just to start us off might be to distinguish between participants, meaning, for example, the members of PIX, which you have more than 800, right, Mayara, today, many different participants. And then let's use the word users for the end users, the people of whom you have more than 150 million today, those enormous big numbers. So 800 participants, 150 million users today. And as we talk user-centricity, we have to think about both because, let's be frank, those two don't necessarily align. Right? There can be tension among them. Areas like fees can be a tension point where the user's interests, participant interests don't necessarily align, but which as a scheme operator, you need to think about how to make that happen. So last thing before we get to explore with Mayara how BCB has gone about thinking about user-centricity in the context of PIX, I'd like to show one picture here, if we could. So we're going to talk, in a sense, inductively in a moment, out of the experience of BCB. Before we do that, here's a very quick deductive lens to think about it. And that is to say there are already a number of frameworks out there which some blend of arguably fits the special context of DPI, which is not fully private, neither is it fully public. It straddles these divides. And so what you can see on the screen there are the overlaps of, first of all, the classic digital product approach, where the concern is adoption. And there are a whole number of principles around UX and UI and things like that which go into those set of principles. The second, I've mentioned, the OECD has built on the work of a number of its member governments and has published guidelines as recently as 2 years ago, thinking about what this looks like in the public sector. But we know that for important infrastructure, that's not enough simply to think of that. We have to think also about responsible use and some of the risks that go with that, and hence bringing in the responsible finance framework, which says we need to think about risks in advance and even mitigate them when they occur. And of course, as a large public system, any DPI would be subject to thinking about its broader stakeholders, where frameworks like ESG frameworks that are concerned with broad impact would come into play as we think about what it means to be user-centric. So at the overlap of those 4 different sets, if we're thinking deductively, it's possible to at least isolate principles like those 5 that you can see in front of you there. There's no rocket science in those, but this is part of an exploration of that question. What does high-functioning DPI look like? And the deductive approach would say, maybe it looks like fulfilling at least those things, and maybe more as well. But so much for the deductive. Let's talk inductively, because the real experience, Maya, is so much more fascinating than anything deductive that we might do. So we've heard those big numbers, but we've already said, and your boss or boss's boss or whatever has told us the numbers alone are not enough. Can you tell us, and all of us here today, about how in the PICS unit you started to understand user needs at the beginning and then over time, which is really linked to that first principle and even the second?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. For us, it's really always a very good opportunity to share our experience with PICS. For us to design PICS, the international experience was really important as well. So for us, it's really good to give some back. Well, first of all, we had exactly to identify all the stakeholders, and not only the PICS participants, as you said, but also the needs of the end users. We, as regulators, we were really used to talk to financial institutions, payment institutions, credit unions, but what about the end users? How we identify what they need? Because our concern was we have to design a very good product, a very good service, but people have to be aware of it, have to trust on it, rely on it, so they can use and they can understand it. So on participant side, we made the process of designing PICS really participative, and also we discussed about we not only want to mandate the big institutions, but they have to be keen to offer the best service as they can design it. So how to engage these participants, and not only the big incumbents, but also the new players. So how we can set up a business model that it would be, on one hand, free of charge for individuals, but they can have their profit on the merchant side, for instance. So we were very concerned to bring the participants together so they can understand that if they are losing fees for one hand, they have a new whole of opportunities, new service, new solutions they can offer, and also a lot of new individuals would be included on the system so they can have offers other financial products. And on the side of end users, for us was a big challenge to hear the end users. So we set up back in 2019 a survey with individuals and also with merchants to identify their payment habits and why they choose each alternative in each specific situation. So we also did not only interviews, but also a payment diary for 1 whole month, so we could understand these habits and what were also the pain points about all the other electronic means of payments that already existed back then. And we also analyzed the data we had on the other means of payments, so we could understand that, and we could see that the initiating through the smartphones was a very good potential way to go, so we could facilitate all this process.
Wow, thank you, Maria. So you've raised a number of angles there that it might be useful to dig into. The one is you mentioned how you had built PIX partly from looking at international experience, and certainly that seems to be happening in this space where you looked at experiences like UPI, and then others coming after you are now looking at your experience, and that raises risks, thinking of the previous discussion, right? The risks that mistakes could be replicated, but we hope part of discussions like this so that good lessons can be learned as well. And what you've told us is you spent time thinking about participants, which as a central bank, in some ways that should come naturally, right? That's what you do. You work with participants in the financial sector, but working with end users, that's a real stretch, right? As you've described it, and you talked about some of the mechanisms, surveys, focus groups, and so on. I guess the question in my mind, and I'm sure the audience's mind, is how do you undergo a cultural shift like that in a central bank from thinking about participants to thinking about end users, 150 million people that you're working for and with here?
Yeah, that was really a challenge for us, as I told. So I think the first very important thing is to have a common vision of the team. So we had to find the right people to conduct this project. So we had a manager that had a really good vision, and this vision was embraced with our board. So we had the conditions to go follow this path. So and also we managed to recruit more people, not many people, because our team is very small, but we could recruit people that had this same mindset, so that understand that it wasn't enough if we want to foster electronic transactions, it wasn't enough to build a very good solution. We have to raise awareness, people had to understand how to use it. So since from the beginning, day one, we were discussing with the industry the fundamentals, requirements of this new ecosystem. We had a really line of work that was considering communication as a very important part of this project, not only defining the regulation and the rules and the technical specification, but also engaging stakeholders, communication strategies, so we could reach all the population, which was a really challenge since Brazil is so huge and diverse.
And that was one of your particular functions, right? The communication aspect of it. Yeah.
Yes.
What I'm very struck by is everyone's now heard just how small your team is, but hearing more from you, as I have had the privilege of doing, you also have had to work with pretty limited resources. So if anyone thinks that a central bank can't function like a lean startup, in many ways the PIX unit at the Central Bank of Brazil is an example of how that's possible. And it does play, Mayra, to one of my concerns in DPI. You know, we've heard a lot about risks, and clearly there are risks about abuse and misuse, and we can talk about how you respond to those in a moment. One of my concerns has always been the risk of no use, right? The risk that nobody takes it up and uses it, and that these projects become big white elephants, as one might say, vanity projects. We heard a little bit earlier about the risk of that in some countries, that could be the case. But it sounds like this lean startup approach under a leadership style in an environment that allowed this to happen helped to create some of the hunger or the scrappiness to see results. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I believe that is correct. And we had a very collaborative and safe environment, so we could all, and diverse as well, so everyone brought their own experience, and we not only shared inside our team our view of how the rules should go on, but also, and more importantly, we had this common shared view that we had to go outside our boundaries and reach out who would be these end users and what are their challenges to use that. And for instance, we decided not to create an app because this would not only have a new whole other challenges, but also we understood that embed the solution in the already existing institutions, bank apps and fintech apps would be much frictionless to the end users to embrace this novelty. So going beyond our boundaries was also really important. And we had to be really inside in Central Bank, we had to really believe this way to develop things and go beyond the status quo and the paradigms already existing and convince other departments to this same vision and this importance. For instance, we had to show the international experience and demonstrate that having a new brand, which brings us new competence and new activities in Central Bank, but this was very important so people would understand doesn't matter if I am a client of a bank A or a fintech B or a credit union, it always peaks, so it would make a lot easier to use it.
Mara, could you tell us a bit more, if we're thinking about again, our question, what's a high-functioning DPI, and then what makes it high-functioning? So in your case, clearly, the Central Bank of Brazil has been the decision maker around the rule sets and the standards that get set and so on, even mandating participation of at least the larger institutions. The others have all been voluntary, right? They've joined, most of them, of their own accord. But could you tell us a bit about the mechanisms you use to consult with participants and how those work in practice? I'm sure there are people interested to hear that.
So back in 2018, we started a working group with the industry, and not only banks and fintechs, but also with end users association and merchants association, so we could discuss the fundamental requirements of this new ecosystem. And this methodology and this systematic gave birth to what we are called nowadays as PIX Forum. That is a permanent committee in which we have working groups, such as security working group, business rules working group, messaging standards working group, and so on. So it's a really open environment. We have more, back then it was about 200 institutions, and nowadays more than all the participants and so on. So we, as a central bank, we develop a technical proposal, for instance, user experience journey on the apps. So we think ourselves of how it should go. We send through email for all the participants of the working group. They give us feedbacks, we analyze, we process that, and then we have a plenary meeting so we can show and present what are the definitions, what we adapt considering the feedbacks the participants gave. So this is a very a good way not only to engage the participants, but also to get on a final proposal that is much, much, much better than our initial one. So this was really important for us to make all this co-creation and make the design much better, because participants in a lot of cases have this direct interface with the end users and can give us feedbacks that make the end product much higher quality.
You almost make it sound easy, Myra, but the idea of this forum, which has not only hundreds of participants, but you've also invited others in, right? You have research organizations and you have consumer organizations, and it sounds like a massive example of an open innovation ecosystem, but one which you've had to manage very carefully, as you described, to invite participation at the right time, but then close and move on. Otherwise, I imagine you'd still be talking in 2024, as opposed to having done something.
Yeah, I think it's really important, a committee really important, because we give the same opportunity to all the actors involved on the usage of PICs to give us suggestions, but it's also really important for us to have the power to define. So sometimes it's really in diverse ways of feedbacks, so we can talk with them and then analyze and decide. Otherwise, I think the discussions would go on forever. And we are now just developing a new product that we are planning to launch soon, which is Pix Automático for recurring payments. And we are nowadays just doing that, these public consultations through Pix Forum. And we are also engaging different actors to give us feedbacks on this specific product. So we intended this product to be really open and democratic, not only to big companies such as energy companies and so on, telecoms and so on, but we want the small school of the neighborhood also be able to use it. So we are going on and reaching all these different kinds of business to hear and to understand their needs and what we can do to facilitate not only the understanding, but also to design the product flexible enough to attend all these different needs.
Thanks, Myra. So we want in just a couple of minutes to give an opportunity for a couple of questions from the audience. There hasn't been a lot yet today, and Myra is here with a wealth of knowledge and experience to induce from. Before we go there, Myra, just one more question from me for now, which is, if we look at those principles, one that clearly stands out across all the different frameworks relates to things like grievance redressal. How do you deal with problems when they occur? So can you describe a little bit about how you've thought about that and where you've come to in the PICS process? Because you've now got 5 billion transactions a month, of which some are going to go wrong.
Yes. In May, we just crossed that 5 billion mark. So we have a technical manual specific to deal with grievance between participants and also end user with participants. So if it is with the end user, we incentivize that the end user complains to their own institution. But if they are not satisfied and if the issue is not resolved, they can complain through central bank. So we analyze this data. We guarantee that these complaints are replied to. The participants reply correctly these complaints, and we also make a broader analysis to see what are the most recurring matters and issues that are occurring. For instance, if I type the wrong number and I don't check on the confirmation screen and the money goes to a different person, and how can we go on and raise awareness of how to use properly? Also, scams case, so is it recurrent? The problem is in a specific institution, or what can we do to make the mechanisms that we have better? And also raise awareness that the victim has to be really quick, otherwise the money goes pretty fast. So this is a very important source of feedback for us as well, so we can continually improve the rules and the mechanisms as well.
So it sounds like a key way of building trust has been having clear rules, ensuring that they are enforced in ways maybe we can still touch on. But let's give a chance, Maya, if there's anyone out there just with a couple of questions, that's all we have time for before your lunch in the garden. Maybe is there a microphone that could be taken around? So I see one in the back there.
Thanks. Paul Adams from Innovations for Poverty Action. Fraud is just rife across markets, both advanced and emerging. I can imagine with 5 million transactions running through, that's an impressive data set that you can use to start learning about patterns of fraud. So are you thinking about real-time detection and prediction of fraudulent transactions? Is that perhaps in your roadmap to develop that somewhere in the future? I'd love to find out more about that aspect.
Maya, should we take one more question first and then respond? Michael?
Sure, and it's actually two questions and you can respond anyway. One is, congratulations, but I'm curious in retrospect, what would you do differently? Are there lessons you learned along the way, and would you change things if you were starting over? And second thing, if you can you react to Julie's description of Kenya, and from your perspective, what do you think they should have done?
Difficult ones. I will start with the fraud one. And I think it's a little bit related with this one. So in PICS infrastructure, we have a centralized database of information, and not only regarding the PICS alias, but also regarding security information. So for instance, what date that account was created, how many transactions it has made, and also we have some mechanisms. So if that transaction victim complained and it was a scam or a fraud, we mandate the participants to flag that information, so it is shared to all the ecosystem. So we have this special refund mechanism as well. So once the victim complains, the participant using the PICS infrastructure create this report that goes immediately to the other, to the payee, the fraudster's account holder, so it can block the resources, and then they have 7 days to analyze if it is really a scam or a fraud case, and then reimburse it. What we are doing right now is to raise awareness to the victims, not only to prevent, but if they are a victim on a real case, they have to be quick. And how can we make this process quicker? Because nowadays, most of participants, you have to call a call center and it goes forever. So we are thinking about mandate to have this feature on the bank app, on PICS menu. We believe this would make really easier. And also, we are supervisioning the participants to make sure they're implementing correct all the procedures and to avoid fraud, and also to use this mechanism properly. This mechanism we launched on the end of 2021. So maybe one thing that we could had done differently was to think about this mechanism beforehand and launch together with PICS, but also invest the same effort that we did to raise awareness of how to use PICS, but also how to avoid scams and how to use properly these report mechanisms as well.
Myra, just before you go to Michael's questions, just a quick comment on that. So to me, partly what that touches on is anyone who's launching a DPI today, as you did with PICS, has to anticipate adverse impact like fraud. And it's negligent not to do that. And that's why one of the principles you can see there on the screen is and that comes out of the ESG world and other worlds as well. If you're going to launch something with public scale, you cannot not think about it. And so there's no case for moving fast and breaking things here. Lean innovation is good, but moving fast and breaking things is not good, right, in this case. And what you've described is a very intentional process of upfront thinking and then being aware as these things, fraud mutates over time, and you have to keep track of it, right?
Exactly. And the fraudsters are much quicker than us, so we have to think beforehand, as you said. So with the new features, for example, this new product, we are already thinking about how to create mechanisms to avoid fraud in these cases. And I believe that another thing that impacts on giving the proper incentive to participants to do their job correctly is also that we publish data. So we have a quality service index that one aspect of it is also not only availability and timeouts, but also complaints. So this is also important because they don't want to have a lot of complaints, otherwise they will lose clients. So I think differently we could also move faster between on this preventing fraud and creating the security mechanism, but also to guarantee the infrastructure and the resources to maintain the rhythm of developments, further developments, compatible to the usage of PICs. So we have a lot of challenges to going and having a right amount of collaborators on our team. So that's also, we were talking about on the workshop, maybe a set up beforehand parameters. So if it goes from 700 to 800 participants, how many more people you have to have on your team to be able to oversee everyone? That's a good example of what we could negotiate beforehand to guarantee the proper structure.
And then there was the question about, from the discussion about Kenya, what do you take away from that as issues that you need to think about in your environment, which is not, it's different in Brazil?
Yeah. That's a good one. I think it's really important to raise trust to the population and to proper reach and give good information so that all citizens know how to use it and know how to protect themselves. And this, for us as central bank, is a real challenge, not only because we don't have a budget for it, but also because Brazil is such a big country and we have limited access. So we made a lot of effort in making partnerships with who is talking to these people that we want to reach. So from associations to digital influencers, so how we can make partnerships so we can facilitate to public content, good content to all the population. So I think that's about it.
Thank you. That is a hard one, and it's an appropriate one for us, I think, to land on at the end of the session today. Let me add something, actually, that I would recognize in what I know about your situation, PICS. I think you, the central bank, have been exemplary in providing access to data about what's going on. So in terms of one of the conditions that we heard about, the absence of that around a DPI is a problem. And I think for anyone embarking on a DPI building journey, to not commit to a transparency around the numbers and deeper than the numbers. You mentioned the quality service levels that you monitor and you report for each institution. There's a very high level of transparency that can help to build greater accountability and can help to move towards that quadrant, the upper right-hand quadrant of high-functioning DPI. So we're very aware we've reached the end of our session today. Thank you so much, Mayara. It's in the context of what we hope is an active journey, because this learning is going on actively between you and many other countries during Brazil's presidency. During the discussions I've had with India, with South Africa, next year's presidency, they are all actively seeking to learn these things too. And I think one of the hopes of the RFF is that this could be a forum in which principles like these, not only deductively, but inductively, can be distilled to take away what is good practice that makes it more likely that we have high-functioning DPIs, that bring the big numbers, certainly, that matters, but more than that, they bring the customer journeys, which are ones of impact, that meet the hope that we all have for them. So with that, please join me in thanking Mayara and congratulating her team at BCG.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Frank, back to you.